So, ladies and gentlemen, one of the great visionary infrastructure projects that was announced by the federal government yesterday, the pipeline, is what you're going to be hearing about. The oil and gas industry, which continues to be vibrant, not only for Canada, but also for Surrey, creating jobs, contributing to our communities, and contributing to the needed investments that we need. So I'm so pleased to have with us to speak about that the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Terry Abel.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much to Anita and the Surrey Board of Trade for giving me the opportunity to come and speak with you this evening. I'm amazed, Anita, to hear you've been here 26 years, 13 years at the helm. I was listening to you tonight thinking how she must be new to this job with all that passion and energy and excitement. It's just amazing, and it kind of invigorates me and gives me a little bit lifted spirits given what my industry is going through right now. Over the past 4 years, Surrey Board of Trade has been an enormous support to CAPP and generally to Canada's oil and gas industry. You are an important region for our sector. I think most of you know that there are hundreds of suppliers here in the Surrey area that's supporting Canada's natural gas and oil industry, broadly and in general. This is an important home for hundreds of suppliers, and we thank you for what you do for our industry. But in particular, in addition to Anita and Heather, I want to thank the entire Surrey Board of Trade and your team for encouraging our involvement in your activities. And I want you to know that you do important projects that help our industry, and you can continue to count on our support for years to come. It is nice in the Lower Mainland to see someone work so hard to ensure there's a balanced conversation about our industry. It's not something we see all the time, and it is encouraging to see that happening here. And like all of your businesses, we want to grow as well. That is what we're aiming to do, and that's what we're struggling with this year and in the past 4 or 5 years. In my 36 years working in this industry, I've seen loads of ups and downs. It's kind of normal for our industry. They're created by global events and many of our own doing here in Canada as well. But I've always seen in our industry during those difficult times, we've been able to rise up from those difficult times, largely due to the ingenuity and the strength and the resiliency of the women and men that work in our industry. But I can tell you that in my 36 years, I have never seen our Canadian industry faced with the number and diversity of headwinds that we are today. So I am really happy to be able to come and talk to you a little bit tonight and share some of my thoughts and observations on the state of our industry. And I will get to pipelines, but I'm going to get there after I talk a little bit about our industry first. So one of the things I've noticed when we have discussions about energy is that they lack context. They lack some simple grounds of important facts that allow us to have a really good discussion. So every time I talk about our industry, I like to start with a bit of context. And this quote from the IEA's Energy Outlook really sums it up for me. By 2040, the world's population is forecast to grow to somewhere north of 9.2 billion people. And in that same period, the middle class across the globe is going to double in size. In order to support those people and support that growth in the world is going to need substantially more energy, and absolutely that energy is going to come in all forms. It is a fundamental fact that we like everybody to ground themselves in. And when you look a little bit deeper into that energy mix, I think you'll see some other interesting facts. So the IEA, and there's a lot of other agencies that do the same kind of thing, forecast energy growth and needs for some time to come. They all generally come to the same conclusions and have similar numbers. I like to focus on them because they're international. But they forecast that by 2040, the world is going to need approximately 350 million barrels a day of equivalent oil. And despite the growth in all those other forms of energy that you can see here, oil is still going to make up 29% of that demand, and gas will make up a full quarter of that demand. And notice even coal, it's not declining yet in the next 2 decades. It's still actually growing by a very small amount. But this slide really, for me, illustrates why context is so important. I think you all hear many times numbers quoted like renewables in the next couple of decades are going to grow 300%. And most people, when they hear that kind of a number, they think, well, that must mean that renewables are going to be the majority of where energy comes from in the world. And you can see clearly from this forecast that while, yes, it's a very steep increase, it is by no means making up the majority of the energy that the world's going to use. I wanted to show you this slide. It's another clip from the IEA's World Energy Outlook, but I wanted to show you just to highlight where the majority of the oil demand is coming from in the world as those demands grow. And you can clearly see from this slide why my producers and members are so focused on markets in China and India and Korea and Japan, and why pipelines for our industry to the west coast of Canada are really so important. Even more broadly than oil, energy demand and the emerging markets in Southeast Asia are actually the main driving source behind that 27% growth in energy needs across the world. In that time, those economies are actually accounting for about half of the natural gas demand growth, especially in China, where because of the pollution problems that they have there, and any of you that have been there will know that on certain times, especially in the fall, they are trying to replace a lot of their coal-fired generation to deal with those pollution challenges. And natural gas is what they're turning to predominantly to do that. So with that simple facts and context, let me talk a little bit about Canada now. So in case you didn't know, Canada is actually the world's 5th largest natural gas producer. And what I want you to pay attention to on this slide as well, because we'll come back to it a little bit later, is who the #1 gas producer in the world is. And you should also note at this point that that very large US producer is also the only export market for Canada's natural gas at this point in time. On the oil side, Canada is currently the world's 6th largest crude oil producer. And again, note who the biggest one is. And again, note that over 95% of Canada's oil exports go to that single customer. And it's also important to highlight here, when we start to talk about potential of our industry, that despite being the 6th largest producer of oil in the world, Canada actually holds the 3rd largest reserves of crude oil in the world, only behind Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. So when you think of our potential, we actually have the raw material to be right at the top of that chart. So just last week, CAPP released its annual crude oil production forecast, and because we're going to talk pipelines, I focused here on oil. We don't normally do a natural gas forecast, but given the importance of that in North America, we're probably going to start doing that at some point. But what I wanted you to see here is that our forecasts have moderated over time. Here, the higher line that you see there is back in 2014 when the price of oil was, well, at the time the forecast came out, which is June, it was probably in excess of $100 US a barrel at that time. But you can see that we've substantially moderated our forecast. And while we still expect to see a growth in the neighborhood of 1.3 million barrels a day by 2035, you can see that's actually slowed down substantially from 2014. One of the biggest reasons that it's slowed down, all of you as business owners will know that, when there is such a decline in capital investment in our industry, only one thing can happen, and that is you're going to slow down. That is a substantial decrease in capital investment over the last 5 years. And you know, another point here I can make for you just to put it into some perspective. Within the last 3 years, global capital investment in the oil and gas industry has actually been on the rise. And in fact, in the last year, it's probably up 15 to 20%. In that same time, these same 5 years that we're talking about here, we have seen a year after year decline in oil sands investment in Canada. I think this year we're forecasting it to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $13 billion. So it was as high as $26 billion a year and growing. So to put Canada's situation in the global context I provided earlier, you could clearly see why we're so focused on growth. There is an incredible opportunity out there with the world growing and needing more oil and gas, particularly gas. And we think we could be part of that opportunity. But unfortunately, right now, the Canadian industry is essentially being left on the sidelines. It's unfortunate because Canada has probably the strongest environmental regulations that ensure the energy we produce here is probably the most responsibly produced on the planet. And I can say this from direct experience. I've been in the industry for 36 years, but 30 of those years I worked as a regulator. I worked closely with these people, so I was the one going through these long hearings. Well, they weren't so long back when I was going through them. But I can tell you, having worked with almost every jurisdiction in the world, Canada's regulations and requirements and the systems that support those requirements are unparalleled, and nothing comes close. And maybe even more important in these days where all we seem to do is talk about one aspect of the environment, climate change, when you look back at that list of top 10 crude oil producers, there isn't a single one of those producers that has climate regulations in place. And there's lots of debate about what the right things to do are and what the right policy is, but nobody has rules like Canada does, and they will always be good rules, regardless of what party's in place, because the industry actually cares and has been doing things well in advance of actually having regulations in place. We are positioned to be one of the leading global suppliers of responsible energy, and unfortunately, we're falling behind. Primarily because of the lack of pipelines and efficient regulatory process requirements, we are stagnant and perhaps even running at risk, and many of my producer members now are actually not just hanging on, they're starting to disappear. They're not able to hang on. They're starved for capital, costs are high, regulatory and otherwise, and we're actually starting to lose companies in our industry again. So I think what I wanted to then jump to for you is to give you a little bit of a flavor of what our industry actually means for Canada and get you thinking about what it could mean for Canada. So despite all of that reduced investments, lower prices, all the challenges we've been facing, our industry is still the largest private sector investor in Canada. We still contribute in excess of $7 billion a year to government coffers. We represent 6% of Canada's GDP. And we're actually, in just the oil sands area alone, we're producing and attracting goods from over 2,200 different companies across Canada. In fact, we do, I'm trying to think the most recent numbers, in the last 2 years, or maybe 17, 18, we did in excess of $2 billion in procurement contracts with Indigenous businesses alone. We also provide, despite, and you've heard of the layoffs in Calgary, there was more announcements this last week about Repsol laying off up to 30% of their Canadian workforce. For the people in this room, that's probably in excess of 200 people. But we're still providing and supporting 528,000 direct and indirect jobs. And that's across Canada. And I just wanted to give you one example to demonstrate that these benefits actually are felt across Canada. Clearly, you can see that the majority of jobs are in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin out west here, but we are supporting jobs in virtually every single province in the country and territory in the country. And BC sees a lot of benefits as well from its industry. You may not realize it, but you're producing 30% of the natural gas in Canada right here in this province. You are attracting for that industry capital investment in the neighborhood of $4 to $5 billion a year. You're employing 10,000 people directly into the industry, and you're providing over $500 million of revenue into your provincial governments. And not just for your own industry, and I talked about it a little bit, but in 2014 and 15, just supporting the oil sands again alone, there were in excess of $1 billion of goods and services bought and paid for from over 700 BC companies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the headwinds to growth, and there's lots of details that I could talk about, but they fall generally into three categories. Right at the top of the list, we've talked about it already, is market access. Canada's 4 million barrel a day pipeline system for oil is running at capacity, which means producers have limited ability to get their product to market. And the fact that it's running at capacity is really a turnoff for investors. When they can't be certain you can get that product to a market efficiently and effectively, they are very reluctant to make any more investments in that industry. And you saw it in the fall when your customers know that you may be producing more or that your transportation infrastructure is at its capacity. Crazy things can happen with prices, and you can see very, very depressed prices. And we saw that before Alberta instituted a curtailment program where we were selling at discounts in the neighborhood of $40 a barrel to WTI. And the natural gas market is not immune to these problems as well. It is even more saturated and is, as a result, highly competitive. And we've seen similar steep discounts in price because of our lack of ability to move that gas product into markets as well. For the first time in my career in the last 2 years, we've actually seen AECO spot prices for gas go negative. That means people are actually paying to get rid of their gas. Taxes. Canada's once proud reputation as having a tax advantage over most other jurisdictions has virtually disappeared under the current US administration. And perhaps even more shocking to me, having been a regulator and knowing what our systems are like here, for the first time in my career, I am hearing from global investors who are placing a risk premium on Canadian oil and gas investments because of our regulatory complexity, the uncertainty of our system, and apparent inability to execute major projects. I have never seen that. I never thought I would see that. We used to be able, we have higher costs here. We will always have higher costs here, largely because of our regulatory environment and our strict environmental requirements. But that never bothered investors before, because they could count on Canada to build things and they could count on stability, and that is not the case anymore. I can talk a little bit about the two big challenges we still face at the federal level. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I think many of you have heard a lot about this, and you should be familiar with these two bills. But on 69, I want to comment a little bit about another phenomena that I've never seen before. I have seen now industry CEOs, industry associations, not just our own, banks, investors, Indigenous groups, and unprecedented numbers of average Canadians speaking out to the government and Senate, warning them that that bill, C-69 in its current form, is going to be a significant barrier to future investment and put jobs at risk in Canada. I've never seen anything like that in my career where, I was just talking to some senators this week. They were saying that, in talking to their colleagues, in the last few days since the government returned the Bill C-69 to them, they've had in excess of 10,000 different letters from average Canadians and over 2,000 phone calls. Senators don't get phone calls in this country, and that's the kind of concern that's being expressed by Canadians. C-48, part of my context was to explain to you why West Coast access is so vitally important. The new markets are in Southeast Asia, and we're a straight shot to Southeast Asia off the northern BC coast. We know we can do that responsibly. We know we can put protections in place. There has been tons of testimony, whether it's through Northern Gateway or the government's own hearings on C-48 across Canada, that things can be done well. There is no scientific basis to stop that. But that's exactly the effect of Bill C-48. It will mean not that other tankers can't travel that coast. Other tankers can travel that coast. It's maritime law. There is an agreement not to travel in certain areas, but they can also travel those areas if they need to for safety reasons, and they will. But we cannot move oil off the coast under that bill. It's a permanent ban and has no basis in science. It's kind of shocking that because of the discounts on our oil, it's actually being bought down in the US, loaded onto tankers in the Gulf Coast, sailed through the canal, the Suez Canal, and then back up to China. We could do that in a fraction of the time at a fraction of the cost. And the decision on Trans Mountain's expansion is going to help, but it's not the silver bullet for exporting the volumes that we could be and should be exporting. You cannot bring the large super tankers into Port Metro Vancouver. You need a deep water port that can accept those tankers. And that was really what C-48 is preventing. Northern Gateway was actually proposing to do that before the government canceled that particular project and overturned the approval that had been granted. So that's kind of got me into the competition piece. You hear my industry talk over and over again about we need to be competitive if we're going to attract investment back into Canada in our industry. And we should be attracting it back into Canada because we do produce it in the most responsible way. We're going to set the bar on what you need to do to produce oil and gas when it comes to protecting the climate, protecting water, protecting land. That will always be the case in Canada. I saw that as a regulator for 30 years. Nothing's changed. But the US, and you may have heard some of my colleagues, you may have heard Natasha say it, that our biggest customer has now become our biggest competitor. These charts just simply show you that in a very short amount of time, the US is now on the cusp of becoming a net exporter of energy. And you look at some of those numbers and they are significant. And they are going after the exact same customers that Canada could be going after. It's interesting, I often quote the fact, you hear about our struggles to grow. You see numbers like this where their exports are actually growing. It's kind of crazy, but under the Obama administration, which was at least presenting itself as so environmentally friendly, they were opposing Canadian exports coming into their country. In that time, in the 2 terms he had, they actually grew their own oil production more than Canada's total oil production. They grew by more than everything we produce on the oil side, and the same is true for gas. Oil experts, they used to have laws that said they couldn't export oil. Those laws were changed not that long ago. In 1 year, 2 years, they went basically to 2 million barrels a day of oil exports. They were roughly a million in 2017. A year later, they're at 2 million. That number will continue to grow. On the natural gas side, similar story. There's only 2 ways to export natural gas. It's either by a pipeline or it's by LNG. And what you can see here is the US is using every single opportunity they have. They are exporting gas into Canada when we have more resources than they have, and we have the ability to produce more, but we can't get it to the eastern part of our own country. So the US has taken over that market and is actually squeezing us out of that market. They are exporting as much as they can into Mexico, and they are going after LNG like you would not believe. And just to illustrate, I wanted to show you just what's happened and is expected to happen in the next 5 years. Essentially what this chart is showing you is in the time it has taken us to get 1 LNG facility approved and get it constructed, they will have done 20. All markets that we should be attracting, all markets that we could efficiently deliver our resources to more efficiently. Lowest greenhouse gas intensity LNG on the planet will come from this province. They are today buying gas from this province in Canada, shipping it down to the Gulf Coast, liquefying it, putting it through the Suez Canal, and selling it to China. It makes no sense. Pipelines. Everybody wants to talk about pipelines. I'll talk about pipelines because the story's no different than LNG. This gives you a bit of a peek as to what's happened in the 2 jurisdictions. In the US, they are, again, approving far more pipelines than we could ever approve. You just look at those numbers. I mean, it's exactly the same story as what I showed you on LNG. Trans Mountain, great decision yesterday. Finally, it's reapproved again. Hopefully we don't have to reapprove it a 3rd time. But we know opposition will continue. We expect that, we understand that. You know, the process is thorough, and I think it's important in this day and age to show people we can do this the best technical way possible, the safest way possible. But there will always be people that fundamentally don't want a pipeline approved, no matter how well it's built, no matter how well it's operated. I understand that. And thankfully, the government has made a decision, determined it's in the best interests of the country to proceed with that. And subject to some more regulatory pieces happening and getting figured out, perhaps we can get construction started on that this year. There are some steps to go yet. The NEB has talked a little bit about it in the last day, that they have to figure out how to get the previous record of everything that they did reinstated so that they don't have to redo a whole bunch of process around permits, and hopefully they can find a process to do that. They'll consult with Canadians about what the right process is to do that. We want that. We want something bulletproof and proper at the end of the day, but we need this pipeline. And we need it because we're struggling with the other ones. the few that we have left remaining, and unfortunately they're only serving one customer. I think you probably heard in the last couple weeks that Enbridge's Line 3, which we again thought was on the cusp of getting approved, ran into another court challenge in Minnesota, and they're going to have to do some more process before they can get the final permits from Minnesota and proceed. That pipeline, the expansion or replacement, it's actually built in Canada. Everything is done in Canada. It's all done. We're just waiting for the US to get their act together so that they can complete that piece. Same goes for Keystone XL. TC Energy's Keystone XL pipeline has also hit some hurdles in both Nebraska and Montana. They had a new presidential permit come out, which is probably going to allow them to do a bit of work in Montana. They still got to sort out some routing things and challenges in Nebraska and get those court challenges done so they can get the final Army Corps of Engineers permit and a couple of other things done so they can get on with those projects. This is sort of to sum it up for you on the pipeline side. This is the Permian Basin in Texas. We're getting excited about one pipeline, encouraged about maybe getting 3. These pipelines get approved and built in 18 months to 24 months. And look at how many of them. And it's no accident that they all terminate at a refinery, large refinery, or an export terminal. The US is moving hard to compete with us and take what we think we could do in a more responsible way for the globe. I want to thank you for the time tonight and for listening to me. I have a lot of confidence in our industry. I've lived through a number of challenging times. I've seen us come through it. We have really creative women and men who can figure out answers to problems, can figure out environmental solutions, continue to keep Canada at the forefront in terms of responsible energy production. I think we can help the globe with that. It is going to exist for a long time, that need. I like one of the most responsible producers after Canada, Norway. I like what they say. Because of the way they produce oil, they want the last barrel to be produced from that country. I don't know why we can't do the same in Canada. Thank you very much for your time. I've really enjoyed being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry. And because the Surrey Board of Trade is so efficient in the need and cognizant of the need to identify business opportunities for our very diverse industry sector here in Surrey, we have a business readiness workshop for the pipeline next week, June 25th. If you want more information, go and see my staff, check online, businessinsurrey.com. Just because we have concluded with our AGM doesn't mean that the connecting, the programs, the advocacy stops for the summer. It only continues aggressively. So check out all of our programs and our activities at businessinsurrey.com. Stay engaged. Tell everyone what a great place it is to live, learn, work, and play in Surrey. Make it a great business night. Thank you.